Well, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
I'll take that as a yes. Thank you. Um, Let me see. Um, I'm looking at the list. I think we can get started. It's only two people haven't logged on yet. Um, First of all, I didn't record our oh, there we go. Just a minute. Somebody else got on. Austin, very good. All right. So anyway, as I was saying, I didn't record the meeting from last week. If you were there early, you saw that I had my granddaughter with me and stuff, and it was just way too confusing. And my bad. So anyway, let's get started. And I thought we'd start today with a little bit of review of what we've seen. And Lorenzo Ghiberti, Italian, Florentine. Why do we know that? Well, a lot of things, but you can see it's right here, Florence. We saw all of this stuff in Northern Europe by guys named like Jan van Eyck and all of these artists from Northern Europe. And we talked about how they tried to create realism. And they did a pretty good job. They invented oil paint. And as my guy, excuse me, David Hockney said that he thought they used camera obscura and lenses, or maybe even just a regular piece of glass, bottom line. And so that's what they did. And we saw all the exquisite detail they were able to create. We saw the famous Arnolfini and his bride, the famous chandelier that Hockney couldn't draw as much as he tried. And so we know what they did there. And that was an art center. It was huge. What we have here is a rival artistic community in Florence. Bottom line, what they did was that they were trying to create realism. Early in this course, I said that what you'll see for about 300 years is this competition for creating realism. And as we concluded last week, I was telling you that sculpture is kind of a wash because they had great sculpture in both Northern Europe and in Southern Europe, Florence, Italy. And so anyway, I just wanted to kind of separate those two out to begin this. And what we look at today is really the Florentine version of the Renaissance. And so you see what we have here. And this is basically something I've been talking about a lot, how the Florentines actually, is that Maddie? Did I get Maddie? Yes, good. We're all here. Thank you. And so anyway, what the Florentines, how they approach this was not so much with camera obscura, not so much with tracing the light projected on the wall, they thought that they could arrive at this through math and science. And they were really the ones that developed this idea of linear perspective. And you see overlay of perspective orthogonals. And the orthogonals just really mean the lines that all converge at this here vanishing point. But you also see, kind of interestingly, that these orthogonals don't really match up on the horizon line. So it's kind of accurate, but just slightly inaccurate. But why are we going on about this? That's the big question. The big idea is creating realism. And so I think history has pretty much thought that the Florentines won this competition, but it's debatable. I've always characterized this way, that the Northern Renaissance artists were very adept at surface detail. They were really very good at describing folds in the cloth, and they were very good at catching the shine on the chandelier and so on and so on. Bottom line. The Italians, on the other hand, were kind of concerned about big space, a big wide open space, and creating the illusion of deep, believable space. And so this is just a step. Gilberti, this is the same guy who did previous this 1401. He was really kind of one of the first big sculptors of the Italian Renaissance. And as I was going through this, I wanted to show you this. Donatello. He emerges in the early 15th century as one of the great sculptors. And this is a freestanding sculpture. It's not attached to a column or a wall or anything. This is what we call sculpture in the round. Donatello, have any of you guys heard that name before? You guys didn't grow up on the Ninja Turtles? Donatello, Raphael, Michelangelo, Leonardo. Those Ninja Turtles are all named after great Italian artists of the Renaissance era, excuse me. Right? Anyway, so here's another Donatello. We have a niche, but we make the sculpture and put it in there. We didn't carve it right onto the wall itself. Look at the size of this too. It's almost 7 feet high. And this is a modern copy, but it's a true copy. Donatello, this is a relief. St. George, we've seen St. George. We've seen St. George a lot in this other part of the course, ADAH 100. This is the kind of warrior saint that the Christians really tried to model themselves after. Anyway, Donatello again. And here's where we started. So that's bringing you up to date, I think. There's the east doors of the baptistry. This is how sculpture existed. At first, Gilberti, the sacrifice of Isaac, would have been on a door, something like this. And you see, they're 17 feet high. They're huge. And they have all of this gilded bronze attached to the door. They spared no expense when it came to commissioning their artist. And as you've seen so far, everything in the Italian Renaissance to date has been a Christian theme. We see that in the North, they do a lot of Christian art, but they're kind of moving away from it. Arnold Feeney and his wife, those guys are not saints. We saw the Marode altarpiece with the donors sitting on the side. We see that regular people are starting to immortalize themselves through art. Donatello, this is probably his most famous work. And you can see it's pretty much later in life, it's a bronze. And there's a lot to be said for this. And part of the reason why this is so much considered a breakthrough piece, well, you tell me, why do you think this is different from everything we've seen in sculpture so far? How it's alike is that it is a theme, a story, a part of the Bible, David slaying Goliath and becoming the king of Israel, King David. How's it different? You tell me. Tick, tick, tick. So should I tell you how it's different?
Yes, please.
Okay, Sophie, here we go. First of all, his pose is kind of naturalistic. He just slayed Goliath, and there's Goliath's head. We'll zoom in on that. But look at that pose. He's kind of cocky. I just did this. Take that, you Goliath. Whoa, you think? He's looking like, hey, I just did this. Looking kind of proud of himself, don't you think? And this idea of putting weight on one leg, which is what you would naturally do, probably, as you or I would be standing, put your weight on one leg. That's called contra apposto. And that is that he understands how weight is distributed through the body. And he understands when you're standing like this, how some muscles will be relaxed and some will be tightened. That's how our muscles work. It's a system of tightening and loosening. He understood all of that. So that is part of the breakthrough. The other breakthrough, if you hadn't noticed, he doesn't have clothes on. That's a real departure. That kind of sculpture of nude figures hadn't really happened for 1,500 years or so. Not since Roman times have we seen the nude human figure. That's kind of interesting, don't you think? Never seen that, but we'll see beginning with this sculpture, nude figures. So I said it hadn't happened for 1,500 years, probably about 1,000 years, actually. Why didn't you see nude figures for all of those centuries in between, say 500 Common Era to mid 15th century? Any idea why you didn't see the nude arrive portrayed in art? And we certainly didn't see that in the Northern Renaissance. This is the first nude we've seen. Okay, I'll tell you. Humanism. Those artists in Florence and their sponsors, largely the Medici family, and you see this here, the Palazzo Medici. Medicis were a group of very wealthy and powerful people in Florence, and the Palazzo means that it is the plaza, named after the Medicis. And so in the plaza, they decorated it with great sculpture and buildings and just all kinds of things. Bottom line, the Medicis and the artist are trying to revive the values and the knowledge and the attitudes of their ancient Greek and Roman ancestors. Does that make sense? You had the first part of this class, ADAH 100, you would have seen a lot of nude sculpture. And part of that arose from the idea that the Greeks and the Romans both thought that the human body itself was beautiful. And they didn't really have any kind of problems using the human body without clothes as the subject of their art. And so we see that quite often in Greece and Rome. Then we have about 1,000 years of what they call the Middle Ages, roll in the Dark Ages, and all of this other stuff. But what we have is the Christian attitude takes over of not displaying nudity. Now, what was that from? Well, a lot of scholars point to the book of Genesis and the story of Adam and Eve. And the Jan van Eyck Ghent altarpiece that we saw had a naked, nude Adam and Eve on either side. It's the only thing we've seen that showed the human figure nude on all the stuff we looked at. So it stems from that time in the Bible after Adam and Eve had eaten from the fruit of knowledge. Once they did that, they realized they were naked and they were ashamed. I'm paraphrasing, but that's in the book of Genesis, and you can read it if you like, it's there. And it really was the basis for the attitudes towards the nude figure. And this was a revival of that early Greek and Roman times when that really wasn't the attitude. That was pre-Christian. And as such, basically, for 1,000 years here, that was considered to be a pagan and a very sinful attitude. But here we go, 15th century, circa 1450-ish, the nude figure comes back. Now, how does that happen? It happens in part because they wanted to regain the glory of their ancestors, the faded glory, the glory that had gone away, the knowledge and the art that had been lost. And so they started copying. And as they were copying, they noticed that a lot of these are nudes. And it cause them to rethink their ideas of the nude. So we see that come back. This is another Donatello, Penitent Mary Magdalene. Now I know a couple of you guys at least were in ADAH 100 with me. And take a look at this. And can you think of an ancient style that this would remind you of? Not talking. All right. How about Hellenistic Greek art? There were a lot of Greek artists towards the end of the Greek Empire, the last couple of centuries before the Common Era. And a lot of their sculptors were not really creating particularly beauty so much as they were interested in realism. And so you start to see real people, sometimes even people that it looked as unkempt, as sorry, as repentant Mary Magdalene. And so anyway, this is just another indication that these artists were looking at the ancients. And here's another David del Verrocchio. And this is from another Plaza Signoria in Florence, Italy. See, the Florentines were decorating everything with this beautiful sculpture. Same theme, same contrapposto, a little more modest, having covered David with some clothing, but bottom line, Hercules and Ateus. Whoa, this is a theme from ancient Greece. And so they're right there. They're breaking away from all of these biblical themes. This is a biblical theme. That is too, as is this. But we're starting to see an embrace of ancient Greek and Roman, and this is really pretty much in the Hellenistic style as well. This is kind of an interesting piece here too. Della Robbia, Madonna and Child. And this is terracotta. This is made with clay. It's actually ceramic with polychrome glaze. And so they're using whatever they have. One of the things that's kind of interesting in this is that degree of naturalism. Now, this is the Madonna and Child, but we don't see the child giving the blessing. We don't see the child with the book that would foretell his coming. We don't see halos around these two figures. We do see the blue clothing. That's typically how we see the Virgin Mary portrayed. But this baby looks like a baby. That was something they struggled with for many years through the Christian era. So they're breaking away. And this is an equestrian statue. This looks like something right out of ancient Rome. Del Verrocchio. And see, this is where we would see this, the We call that an equestrian statue. Basically, equestrian just means horseback and so on. But at any rate, look, this looks like a Roman warrior. And so anyway, that's sculpture. Let me show you some painting. Early 15th century. This is kind of where they begin with the advancement of painting in Florence. And see, this is in Florence, from Florence. And this is called the international style. And basically, they start off, the painters are not emulating Greek and Roman painting. Why not? I'll tell you. There's not much in the way of examples of Greek and Roman painting, especially available to these artists. So they really kind of start off emulating Byzantine era paintings. And this is complete with all of the Byzantine symbolism, the halos. There's Joseph, the old Joseph, as we discussed before. Halos, Christ giving the Magi a blessing. These are the three Magi here. And let me see, where we have everybody here. They're trying to come adore the Christ child. We have over here, this is kind of interesting, Holy Spirit. And then we see this landscape that goes way back into the distance. And so this is really the international style. It borrows very heavily from, let me zoom in. I'm gonna find my, where'd it go? I lost my mouse. There it is. And especially even to the idea, the Byzantine idea, that the most important figure is highest and it is central. And that's Jesus right there. And so anyway, they borrow very heavily from Byzantine style, and a lot of the ornate gilded wood is all part of that. And so they go from the international style to this. And this is really roughly the same time, 1424. This was one of the paintings that David Hockney was talking about. He was actually in the Brancacci chapel when he was talking about light on the side of the face and all this stuff. This was to the Florentines, to the whole world. This was like IMAX. This was huge. It's 8 feet, 4 inches high, 19.5 feet across. And this is where you see the difference between Italian Renaissance and Northern Renaissance. Northern Renaissance is typically small because of the way that they painted things through the camera obscura. This is huge. And you can see that they use perspective lines here, and the perspective lines start to take on a theological importance too, because all of these perspective lines and the horizon line would converge on Christ, who is the central figure. That's something that we've seen. We've seen central figure, most important. Anybody have an idea of what this is telling us? Tribute money? New Testament. It's the story. It's the story of Saint Peter. And that's him right there. That's him right here. And that's him right there. The tax collector is here and here. The rest of these folks, the rest of the apostles. So, this is in the New Testament. Saint Peter, because he was a fisherman, he's there and he's got his fish, these are the fish that he had caught that day, and he's cleaning his fish, and inside the mouth of one of the fish, he finds a coin, a Roman coin, money. And so St. Peter's thinking, hey, my lucky day. Second part of the story. Here, Peter has this coin. The tax collector wants the coin. That's what tax collectors do. So Jesus is in between the tax collector and St. Peter. And he orders St. Peter to give the tax collector the money. And Jesus famously said this. So look at that coin. Whose image is on that coin? St. Peter. It's the image of Caesar. Caesar, if it has his image, that coin belongs to Caesar, and you give this coin back to Caesar's agent. And Christ concludes his admonition by saying, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto the Lord what is the Lord's. And that's what this tells you. And finally, there's St. Peter, and he's given it up. There's a few other things here too, and that is that you see all of the disciples have halos. Tax collector, no halo. Say he's not a saint. And so it's fresco, and they've created this big, awesome story right there. And it was like magic. People had never seen anything like this. Painting had arrived. And Masaccio, the painter here, he was drawing upon some of the discoveries made by others in Florence. One of whom was Brancusi. We'll talk about that. But at any rate, this is what this is. And one of the things that I like about this, I want you to think about this, you could really divide this up into 3 sections. It's almost like 3 scenes kind of put together into the same space. This becomes actually how art, at least it's a new invention, on how painting can tell a story. And if you were to put frames around it, this would be a 3-panel piece that would look like a modern graphic novel. Scene 1, scene 2, scene 3. So when you're reading graphic novels and you want to know how this all came about, that you would tell a story frame by frame by frame, you're looking at it. This is the granddaddy, grandmother of them all. And so Masaccio, expulsion of Adam and Eve from Eden, There they are, nude again. This is another Masaccio. You can't really get the full effect of this, but this has perspective lines too. As a matter of fact, the way that he painted this, although it's all somewhat in a state of disrepair because it's like 600 years old, it looks like a big hole in the wall. And he paints this vaulted ceiling and the columns, Blessed Virgin Mary, right there, Mother of Christ, got the halo. And she seems to be saying, look what you did. Look what he did. He gave his life for you. Over here, St. John, the apostle, the youngest of the apostles, and the one that didn't run away when Christ was being crucified. And so anyway, here's what you have. And there's God, there's Jesus in his glory, the resurrected Jesus, the crucified Jesus, the resurrected Jesus. And so then that becomes what's going on here. This guy, that woman. Donors. We saw that in the Marode altarpiece. See, a lot of these private business people are starting to make a lot of money, and they are sponsoring a lot of the art, even though they are not clergy. They're sponsoring, they're commissioning this work in conjunction with the local clergy. And right here, you can't read it, but this is yet another part of the painting. It's all flat, although it looks three-dimensional. It's flat, and it has a coffin, an open coffin here. You see that lid, and inside it is a quote, more or less, from ashes to ashes, from dust to dust. And so anyway, we see this is kind of an interesting idea. Fra Angelico, that was his artist name, and they called him Angelico because he painted angels, and especially he painted these very, very beautiful, very elaborate wings. And so basically the name means I am the monk. Oh. Sorry. Anyway, Fra Angelico, Annunciation in the monks' quarters, San Marco, Florence, Italy. Fresco. Fresco is typically the medium of choice from the Italian Renaissance. It is what they use. The Northern Renaissance oil paint, they use fresco. Fresco, by the way, is Italian for fresh. And what it is that it is plaster with pigment. And you have to mix the pigment and the plaster to the correct color, lay it on there, and let it dry. And once it's dried, you can't work it again. So, and it would dry quickly, to be sure. And so they would paint this by layering areas of plaster. So kind of take a look at this. This is like really quite incredible that they could paint with fresco and create this amount of detail. Now they would plan these paintings out, to be sure, and they would paint out what they could paint, what they could create in one day's time. before the plaster, before the fresco dried. And so when you get up close to these, you can kind of see what they would be able to do in one day. But Castiglione, Last Supper, Florence, Italy, the refectory in the convent. And so anyway, the Last Supper, we'll see this as a recurring story. And this is very much in with all of that linear perspective that I've been talking about. And this being the horizon line that cuts right through Christ. And if you know Christianity, you can have an idea who this guy is. He's not sitting with the group. That would be Judas, the one who betrays Jesus. And so anyway, you have to know the Bible to kind of understand this. This is the Battle of San Romano. And this was a battle, basically, what we had in Italy, city-states. I've talked about that a little bit so far. And basically what you had was a fortress, and I was talking about having cities walled off. You see this big wall here, and over here we have the farmland, and we see this army and this army engaged in battle. And really kind of a study in perspective, which makes this kind of an interesting painting. In this, one of the things that Uccello does is that he lines a lot of this stuff up to emphasize the orthogonals of 1 point linear perspective, which is really kind of cool. Uccello becomes quite a master at linear perspective. And he's one of the early artists that figures out that as long as you know the method of creating 1 point linear perspective, you can pretty much make anything you like from your imagination. And a lot of Uccello's drawings as such are really quite remarkable. In fact, they have been scanned and they have been run through computers, and they are correct. Just like Hockney showed you with the Arnolfini and wife chandelier. Scan it, run through a computer, and you could turn it all in all different kinds of ways because it was mathematically correct. And so that's what we're talking about. This is what happens in art. Bottom line, we see some more of that humanism emerging later in the century. And this is Madonna and Child with Angels. And again, we see just barely a trace of the halo here and there. The baby looks, again, more like the baby. And this angel is actually kind of playfully looking back at the viewer. We see the Madonna, but she doesn't have a head covering. She's actually got quite an ornamental headdress here, and her hair has been wonderfully coiffed, and some jewelry and some silk and lace and all of this. Humanism. They are making Christ and the Madonna more human. Piero della Francesca another great painter of this era in Florence. This is a mural in Borgo San Sepolcro. It's hard to say, sorry. But anyway, resurrection. If you know the story about Easter, and that is that Christ was crucified, was buried, and on the third day, he rose from the dead. I've always liked this painting for a number of reasons. One is that, and this is a big thing, they contextualize this biblical story in the present of, in the time of 15th century Italy. Because if you know historically, where Christ was buried was probably similar to kind of a cutout or a cave, and a big rock rolled over it so as to seal off the tomb. This is kind of a sarcophagus. That is like a big marble coffin. And we see Jesus, and he's got the flag, Christian flag, the cross. And these soldiers, this is what intrigues me more than anything. These are not Roman soldiers that were sent there to guard the tomb so that no one would steal the body of Christ, that not to have him be a martyr, not to have him be, how should I say this? They do this with a lot of figures, not be kidnap, steal dead bodies. It still happened. In that time it did especially, but even through the 19th century, there was somebody that had threatened to steal the body of Abraham Lincoln in the 1870s. And they wanted money for his body. Anyway, bottom line. But these are soldiers, contemporary soldiers. That would be like our guys if it was done today. They'd be wearing camo and body armor and helmets and stuff. So anyway, it's kind of interesting. But why would they do this? Well, maybe they didn't have the historical record, but we saw in the sculpture, those equestrian statues, that they could give a reasonable facsimile to Roman soldiers. Tend to think that this is created this way so that people looking at this would understand they were soldiers. And so they gave them what is, in a sense, 15th century uniforms. Della Francesca, always doing proving of the true cross. These are all frescoes, various biblical scenes, various important scenes post-biblical times. And the flagellation. And this is where we're going to talk about humanism a little bit and the donors. We see Christ, and he's about ready to be whipped. We see Pilate, presumably Pilate here watching this, and the flagellation of Christ. But that's in the background. Look what's in the foreground. These are three guys, three kind of wealthy, kind of sophisticated Florentines. And so they're kind of dressed in their finery. They got all of the silks and stuff that come through Italy from the east, and they're sitting there talking, and they're probably discussing something quite lofty philosophically, but bottom line, they're in the foreground. We've changed positions. And that's a different kind of thing. The other part of this is that we start to see the emergence of oil paint in Italy. There's a lot of exchange going on between Florence and Northern Europe. And so the birth of the Virgin, we see all of this believable space. And you can see this is like a huge painting. It's a huge mural, 14 feet high, 24 and a half feet wide, almost 15 high. Whoa. And so this is kind of exactly the difference between Northern and Southern Renaissance art. One of the things that we see emerge is this idea of getting your own portraits painted. No longer are artists regulated to doing religious art. They could do other things. And having wealthy people commission these expensive artists to do portraits, that's a whole different thing. Sandro Botticelli, Primavera, Spring. We start to see this. This is actually kind of a combination of Christian and excuse me, classical art. And you would know this a little more. There it is. With this, Botticelli, classicism, Roman goddess, Venus. And we see that nudity we've been talking about, the glorification of the human body. And this comes right out of Roman mythology. Venus is the Roman version of the Greek Aphrodite. Comes in on the wind. You see she's on the half shell, bottom line. And so we got this humanism, we got this classicism, and it's right out in the open. And this is in the Uffizi Gallery. And see, this is like 6 feet high, 9 feet across. Huge. And this is like hugely famous. This is kind of considered one of the high points of the Italian Renaissance. There's still a few things on it that are not exactly realistic. The human body, pretty accurate. Look at those waves, the water. It's really like kind of more symbolic. Bottom line is though, they've gotten it. They've been able to create these patterns on the folds. They've been able to show the form inside the cloth, inside the clothing. And so this is kind of the point, 1480s, where all of the stuff that they developed in the Northern Renaissance and a lot of the things that developed in the Southern Renaissance, they merge. They are doing a big exchange of artistic methods. And this is what you get. But I want to tell you one more thing. And this is important historically, artistically. What you find in the North is that they don't really embrace all of this nudity and this Greco-Roman glorification of the human figure. They would be in today's vernacular and today's classification much more conservative. They didn't go along with this. They thought this was pagan. They thought this was, in a lot of ways, sinful and decadent. And so you won't find these nude figures in Northern Renaissance art. It doesn't happen. And you won't see the references to ancient Greek and Rome. And so this is in the Vatican. This is late 15th century. And you can see the idea of one point perspective converging here on the church, by the way, and Christ giving the keys to the kingdom to St. Peter. And so not only Mantegna's got here's one that's really quite remarkable. Ceiling of the Camera Picta, painted chamber. And this was painted by a wealthy royal, and it's painted in a bedroom. And it was kind of a wedding present of sort to his new bride. And he thought it was kind of funny to have this placed above their bed where they would have all of these these angels and people and even animals looking down on them in bed. The guy had a sense of humor, to say the least. But the idea that one could paint a ceiling that could be believable, and we have some angels here, by the way, too, and we see these, and other people just looking down. I'm standing around the edges. But the idea that you could paint illusions this well, this is what they developed in the 15th century, both a product of Northern Renaissance and Southern Renaissance. And they kind of looked at each other and they kind of exchanged ideas. It wasn't quite an open exchange, though. And this is an important point. Mostly what they would do is just kind of do what you'd call reverse engineering, where you would look at something and then figure out how they did it. And so I always liken this. This is kind of an overall statement, but it's almost as though if you were to have an analogy in this day and age of Northern Renaissance and Italian Renaissance, they both had a lot of inventions. They both made remarkable progress in the ability to create the illusion of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. They made great progress in developing realism and naturalism and photographic images. And that's what Hockney was talking about, how they were doing all of this stuff. But they kind of got there independently and collectively. And the rivalry between those two groups of artists, I always liken to having Windows or Macintosh. It's almost like the difference between iPhones and Android phones. And they kind of borrow from each other, and you'll see iPhone comes out with a particular kind of feature. They have cameras that can take still shots while you're moving. You'll see the Android phones, the Samsung, the Google phones, and all of those. They'll come out with one. They both sue each other all the time. It's always in court because they accuse each other of stealing their trade secrets. And that's what we have here. These artists were not particularly interested in sharing their trade secrets, if you will, with the rest of the world. Didn't happen. It was competition. And if you could make a better painting, you didn't share it. You kept that to yourself. You kept that to your studio. What we have here in both Italy and in Northern Europe is the beginning of what they call artist guilds. Excuse me. Artist guilds where there would be a workshop. They would train young artisans to help produce the paintings, do some of the legwork, mixing the fresco and all this stuff. But the actual way that they did a lot of this stuff was kind of held secret. Play your cards close to the chest, as they say. And so it wasn't like an open exchange. It wasn't like they were sharing everything with everybody for the sake of art. It was like Android and iPhone. Get a Fitbit, get a Apple Watch, something. It's like goes back and forth. They were rivals, they were competitors, but they pushed each other to do better through that competition. And so here's another Mantegna, and this is kind of an interesting way of seeing perspective. We saw Mantegna, the previous one, where you're actually looking up there. He was actually pretty good at this. He has this mural that was destroyed in the Second World War before 1944 bombing. That's why we only have a black and white photo of it. But the way you see St. James being led to martyrdom, and there's St. James there, you can see, kind of see, he's kind of got a halo there. But these are his executioners, and one of his executioners is kneeling down, begging for forgiveness. I have to kill you, but please forgive me. This is not right. The executioners are being led to kill St. James, who was a martyr. But bottom line, look at this. This is where your eye level would be. And you, by extension, you who are looking at this painting are looking up almost as though the viewer is on his or her knees, looking up at St. James and begging for forgiveness. Interesting. And there's what they're trying to restore it. It seems large pieces of it are not there. And Mantegna was good at a lot of things. Like I say, he plays with perspective, point of view, and this is the Dead Christ. Famously painting the wounds, and the body has been pretty much, as you see it, he is bled out, if you will. And so throwing us there, putting Christ's wounds right in our face. Oh, well, putting us right there. Putting us right there. So what Mantegna does is really kind of starts to play around with all of these inventions of being able to create believable images, and be able to put the viewer in a particular position. And so what time is it? It's damn cast into hell. You see, Italian Renaissance. And this is a much more ominous painting, and talking about those who do not lead a good Christian life, that they will be thrown into hell. This is important as well because we'll see Michelangelo in the Last Judgment, some 50 years after this, do this in the Sistine Chapel. And so anyway, printmaking, talked about that, engraving, metal, etched, inked, and applied to paper with burnisher. Bottom line is that they too, in Italy, same kind of exchange. They're figuring out printmaking in Northern Europe, they're figuring it out in Southern Europe. And this is just prior to the printing press, which is the next technological advancement. And so this is the famous cathedral dome, Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. This was done by Brunelleschi, the guy we started off with the sacrifice of Isaac, who lost the competition, but he ended up doing a lot of other things, including teaching some of the painters about 1 point, linear perspective. A lot of the mathematics that go into creating illusions. He was such a good mathematician. He figured out how to build a dome that was actually larger than any dome that had been created. At least it was higher than anything that we'd seen before. And so, so any questions about what I've been showing you? Do you have a kind of an idea of the artistic developments, the different kinds of advancements made in this century, the 15th century, in Western Europe? Because everything that we see in Western art is based on this. That's kind of why I spend a lot of time on it. Even to a point where David Hockney, a contemporary artist, he's trying to figure out what happened, what went on.
Yeah, it was good, sir.
Okay. Thank you. I didn't get who said that, but I appreciate it. Good. Well, I'm glad you guys came. I'm glad we did this on Zoom. The streets are still not particularly good. I didn't want anybody to, well, I want you to stay warm and stay safe. And hopefully we'll be able to meet in person on Wednesday. And secondly, I did get this one recorded, so I'll be able to put it up. So have a good, safe couple of days. I'll see you on Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, see ya.